When you speak of fear, are you speaking about emotions or about the fear of the conflict up there, the war?
When the name Audrey Hepburn is spoken, the immediate association is visual. It is a specific, curated iconography. The slim silhouette in a black Givenchy dress, the cigarette holder poised at a precise angle, the effortless posture that defined a generation's understanding of grace. For decades, she has served as Hollywood's shorthand for elegance, a polished surface that reflects light but reveals little of what lies beneath. However, that enduring image obscures a more complex reality. It hides a history that is darker, quieter, and fundamentally removed from the glamour of the soundstage. To understand the choices Audrey Hepburn made in the final years of her life, specifically her immersion in the world's most desolate conflict zones, one must look past the icon. One must look back to a time before the fame, before the Academy Awards, and before the world knew her name. Long before she was a celebrity, Audrey Hepburn was a child who understood the physical reality of hunger. This is not a metaphor for ambition or a poetic flourish regarding her career. It is a literal fact. As a teenager in the Netherlands during the Second World War, she lived through the Honger Winter, the Dutch famine of 1944 and 1945. This experience was not a brief period of scarcity. It was a systematic, weaponized starvation event that stands as one of the most brutal chapters in modern European history. During the final winter of World War II, in retaliation for a railway strike ordered by the Dutch government in exile, Nazi forces imposed a blockade on food transport to the Western Netherlands. The result was a catastrophic collapse of the food supply for 4.5 million people. Fuel ran out. Butter disappeared. Bread became a memory. For a teenage Audrey Hepburn, life was reduced to the mechanics of survival. She was not acting a role, she was enduring a siege. The population was forced to forage for anything that could sustain life. Families boiled grass and nettles to create a thin, watery soup. When the flour ran out, they ground tulip bulbs into a powder to bake something resembling bread. It was a time of pervasive silence where thousands of civilians died quietly in freezing apartments, their bodies too weak to fight off minor infections. Hepburn was among the children who wasted away during those months. She would later describe herself during this period as very, very undernourished. It was a clinical understatement. She developed edema, a condition where the limbs swell due to severe protein deficiency. She suffered from anemia, respiratory problems, and a chronic weakness that would plague her for the rest of her life. Her metabolism was permanently altered. The slim figure that the fashion world later celebrated as chic was, in reality, the lingering physiological echo of near starvation. She learned, with visceral clarity, the distinction between being hungry and starving. Hunger is a temporary state, easily remedied. Starvation is a physiological process, a slow dismantling of the body's reserves. It attacks not just the muscles, but the mind and the spirit. This distinction never left her. The memory of that winter, the cold, the gnawing emptiness, the sight of neighbors fading away became the foundational trauma of her life. Decades later, as a celebrated actress sitting in the comfort of a television studio, Hepburn would speak about famine with a jarring authority. Her voice remained calm and measured, trained by years of elocution, but the content of her speech was raw. She told interviewers, "It just is so totally unacceptable to see small children just die in front of your eyes. Because they are so frail, they finally die of disease." When she spoke these words, she was not speaking as a charitable observer or a well-meaning celebrity. She was speaking as a witness who remembered what malnutrition does to a child's body. She remembered the lethargy, the swelling joints, and the terrifying fragility of a human being reduced to biology. She remembered the loss of dignity that accompanies extreme deprivation. This history poses a critical question. If you have nearly starved as a child, is it possible to look away from that same suffering when you see it in others later in life? For Audrey Hepburn, the answer was evident. She could not look away. The memory of 1944 ensured that her empathy was not an intellectual exercise, but a reflex. By the late 1980s, Hepburn's life was defined by extreme privilege. She had achieved the highest accolades of her profession, winning an Oscar and securing her place as a legend of cinema. She had earned the right to a quiet retirement in Switzerland. She could have chosen to spend her remaining years in comfort, lending her name to harmless causes from a distance. But fame, in isolation, had begun to feel increasingly hollow to her. She had lived long enough to understand a truth that often escapes those who have never known want: that luxury is meaningless in a world where children are dying of preventable causes. For years, she had supported humanitarian efforts quietly. She had narrated documentaries and lent her voice to fundraising appeals, operating within the safe, established boundaries of celebrity charity. But in 1988 and 1989, her approach shifted. She decided that speaking about suffering from a distance was no longer sufficient. She needed to close the gap. In 1989, Audrey Hepburn was appointed a Goodwill Ambassador for UNICEF. Historically, this role had often been treated as ceremonial, a way for famous figures to draw media attention to a cause without necessarily engaging with the gritty reality of field operations. Hepburn rejected this model. She took the position with a seriousness that surprised the organization's leadership. Her first major field mission took her to Ethiopia. The country was reeling from the convergence of drought, civil war, and the lingering effects of the catastrophic famine that had captured global attention earlier in the decade.
And see the difference UNICEF is helping to make in their lives.
What Hepburn found on the ground shattered any remaining illusions she might have held about the state of the world. She walked through camps where mothers and children had arrived after walking for days, sometimes weeks, across arid terrain. They were searching for food distributions that were often delayed or insufficient. They arrived at makeshift settlements with no guarantee of survival. Hepburn described the scene not with dramatic flair, but with a reporter's eye for detail. She noted that these families were camping in settlements where they might die. There was no suspense in her observation, only a bleak acknowledgement of the odds. She publicly rejected the term Third World, finding it dismissive and divisive. She told the press, "We're all one world. I want people to know that the largest part of humanity is suffering." This was not a rhetorical flourish, it was a demand for a shift in perspective. She was refusing to allow the suffering of millions to be categorized as a distant, foreign problem. From Ethiopia, her work accelerated. She traveled to Turkey, Venezuela, Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Sudan. Each mission was a deliberate step away from the insulation of her celebrity life. She did not travel as a star. There were no entourages, no demands for special accommodation, and no attempts to sanitize the environments she visited. She walked through the dust, sat on the ground, and listened. She sat with mothers whose children were fading in their arms, offering the only thing she had: her presence. At press conferences, her language grew increasingly blunt. The polite restraint of Hollywood gave way to moral urgency. She famously stated, "The human obligation is to help children who are suffering. The rest is luxury." This statement was a direct challenge to her peers and her audience. It reframed the concept of value. Careers, politics, entertainment, art, all of these were redefined as luxury when compared to the fundamental requirement of keeping a child alive. In 1992, this conviction led her to a place that would test her resolve more than any other: Somalia. By 1992, Somalia had effectively ceased to function as a state. It was torn apart by a brutal civil war and was facing the worst drought in decades. The government had collapsed, infrastructure was gone, and food distribution systems had been hijacked by warlords. It was a landscape of total anarchy. Hepburn arrived in September 1992. Almost immediately, she realized that this crisis was distinct from anything she had witnessed in Ethiopia or Sudan. She later described the scene with a word she used sparingly: apocalyptic. She told reporters, "I walked into a nightmare. I have seen nothing like this. So much worse than I could possibly have imagined. I wasn't prepared for this." The scale of the death was overwhelming. Bodies were being loaded onto trucks like cargo. Children with enormous eyes stared silently from the roadside, too weak to cry. The silence was what struck her most. At a press conference, when asked what the worst thing she had seen was, her answer was chilling in its simplicity. She said, "When a child cannot smile anymore, it doesn't bear description." It is a profound observation. A child who is hungry may cry. A child who is in pain may scream. But a child who is too exhausted and depleted to smile has reached the absolute limit of endurance. That is not merely hunger, it is the cessation of hope. The mission took her to Baidoa, a town that the media had dubbed the City of Death. Baidoa was the epicenter of the famine. Outside a therapeutic feeding center, hundreds of people lay on the hard ground. They were not resting, they were waiting. Waiting for food, waiting for medical attention, or simply waiting to die. Hepburn recalled seeing a little girl leaning against a wooden door, wrapped in nothing but a thin cotton cloth. Nearby, a boy was heaving for air, pulling a tattered blanket around his skeletal frame. These were images that would never leave her. But it was inside the feeding center that the full weight of the tragedy descended. The feeding center in Baidoa was not a hospital in the Western sense. It was a place of last resort. The air was thick with heat, dust, and the smell of sickness. There were no beds, no privacy, and no comfort. Children lay on mats on the floor, their limbs wasted, their eyes tracking the movements of the relief workers. Hepburn stepped quietly into this space. She did not enter as a movie star or a symbol of Western benevolence. She entered as a witness. The children here were in such critical condition that they could not chew solid food. They were being fed spoonfuls of therapeutic milk, high-protein formulas designed to restart their stalled metabolisms. Relief workers moved gently among them, knowing that their bodies were incredibly fragile. Too much physical contact could cause pain. Too little care could result in hypothermia. Hepburn sat down on the floor among them. She did not stand above them or pose for photographs. She simply sat. And it was there that she saw him. A young boy, rail-thin, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His chest rose and fell with an uneven, jagged rhythm. Every breath was an enormous labor. Hepburn noticed his eyes immediately, large, dark, and watchful. She later described him as just bones and eyes. Watching him struggle, she was struck by a profound sense of recognition. She recognized his breathing because she had lived it. As a child in the Netherlands, Hepburn had suffered from severe asthma, exacerbated by the malnutrition of the war years. She knew the panic of air hunger. She knew the terrifying sensation of the lungs refusing to fill. Sitting on the dirt floor of the center, she felt an unbearable connection. She later said, "I was suffering so for him because I did have asthma as a child. I remember this crisis of not being able to breathe, and I just felt, I wish I could breathe for him." The phrase is devastating. I wish I could breathe for him. It was an admission of total powerlessness. She could not feed him, for his body might reject it. She could not save him with money or influence. All she could do was witness his struggle and wish, futilely, to take the burden of his breathing onto herself. The boy's struggle intensified. His breaths became shallower. His small body shifted on the mat. Hepburn stayed perfectly still. She didn't want to frighten him. She didn't want to interfere in a medical crisis she wasn't trained to handle. Instead, she felt a sudden, sharp sense of intrusion. She described the feeling later with haunting clarity. Walking into somebody's room who is dying, and the family should be there. She felt that she did not belong in that moment, that such a profound transition should be private, sacred, and surrounded by love. But there was no family. There was no mother holding his hand, no father whispering his name. There were only strangers, relief workers, and the silence of the room. She wanted to touch him. The instinct was to pick him up, to offer human warmth in his final moments. But she restrained herself. She knew that in his condition, even a gentle touch could be agonizing. She said, "They're so frail that you're afraid you're going to break them." So she stayed where she was, watching, helpless. And then it happened. The boy stopped breathing. It was not dramatic. There was no cinematic gasp or final struggle. He simply lay back and he was gone. He died while Audrey Hepburn sat beside him. She would later recount the moment without theatrics. He literally sort of just lay down while I was there and was gone. There was no miracle, no last-minute rescue, just a child dying of hunger in a room full of people who could not save him. If there is a single moment that defines Audrey Hepburn's humanitarian legacy, it is this one. It stripped away everything that the world associated with her. Celebrity, distance, comfort, elegance, all of it was rendered irrelevant. It left only the truth, and the truth in that feeding center was unbearable. Afterward, Hepburn did not break down publicly. She carried the moment with her back to the press conferences and the interviews. When she spoke to the media, her voice carried a new frequency, an urgency born of trauma. Appearing on the McNeil/Lehrer NewsHour, she described what she had witnessed. She did not soften her words for the American audience. She said, "It just is so totally unacceptable to see small children just die in front of your eyes. The broadcast of these words and the images that accompanied them traveled across the globe. They appeared in newspapers, on television screens, and on the desks of government officials. They moved people to tears, but more importantly, they moved the machinery of international aid. Donations to UNICEF surged. Governments that had been hesitant to intervene in the chaotic Somali conflict were pressured to respond. The image of a frail, aging Hollywood icon sitting in the dust beside dying children cut through the political indifference. It made the abstract concept of famine concrete. It was no longer a statistic. It was a reality that someone like Audrey Hepburn had seen and validated. She was careful, however, not to weaponize guilt. She spoke about responsibility rather than shame. She told reporters, "Somalia is our responsibility." She explicitly reminded nations like Britain and Italy, former colonial powers in the region, that they should be doing more. Yet, she also took time to praise the relief workers on the ground. She described them as men and women who live among the living dead and sleep among moaning bodies. She honored those who stayed when it would have been easier to leave, those who continued to work even when it broke them. Despite everything she had seen, Hepburn refused to surrender to despair. She insisted on maintaining hope. She told viewers, "Let's look on the bright side. There are fewer conflicts in the world today than 10 years ago. We're at least trying." This was not denial. It was a strategic choice. She understood that hope is the fuel required for action. Without it, the overwhelming scale of the suffering leads to paralysis. But the cost of this work was real. When she returned home to Switzerland, Hepburn began experiencing severe stomach pain. Medical tests revealed a rare form of abdominal cancer. By the time it was discovered, it was advanced. In December 1992, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The award recognized her humanitarian work, not her film career. She accepted it, though she was already visibly ill. She continued to speak, to advocate, and to give interviews until she physically could not continue. Audrey Hepburn died on January 20th, 1993. She was 63 years old. She passed away less than a year after witnessing that child's final breath in Baidoa. The world mourned an actress. But UNICEF mourned a witness. They mourned someone who had been willing to sit quietly in places most people could not bear to enter. After her death, the images from Somalia did not fade. The photograph of Hepburn cradling a skeletal child became iconic. It was not shocking in the way war photography often is. It was quiet. It showed no performance, only presence. Her legacy within the humanitarian world continued to shape how celebrity advocacy was understood. She had set a new standard, one that required proximity, listening, and humility. She demonstrated that fame, when stripped of ego, could be used as a tool to force the world to pay attention. Years later, the question remains, why did that one moment, the dying child in Baidoa, matter so much? Why does it still resonate? The answer is uncomfortable. It resonates because it exposed a truth we prefer not to confront. That children do not die of hunger because the world lacks food. They die because the world lacks the political will to distribute it. Audrey Hepburn understood this. That is why she never framed the crisis as inevitable. She framed it as unacceptable. And when a person with her cultural authority says something is unacceptable, it becomes harder to ignore. There is a temptation to separate Audrey Hepburn, the actress, from Audrey Hepburn, the humanitarian, to treat them as two distinct chapters of a life. But they are inseparable. The qualities that made her performances timeless, vulnerability, empathy, and restraint, were the same qualities that made her humanitarian work so powerful. She did not dominate a room, she invited reflection. She did not preach, she witnessed. In one of her final interviews, she spoke about hope, not the shallow optimism that ignores reality, but the disciplined hope that drives action. She said the world was at least trying. That mattered to her, because to stop trying would be the real failure. So, when we remember Audrey Hepburn today, it is insufficient to remember only the elegance, the films, and the fashion. We must also remember the quiet figure sitting in a feeding tent in Somalia, the woman who was afraid to touch a dying child for fear of hurting him, the woman who was afraid to intrude on his final moments, but the woman who was unwilling to leave. That is the image that truly defines her. Not glamour, but courage. Her story poses a final challenge to the observer. What is the smallest action one can take that might protect a child's dignity? It does not need to solve the crisis, it just needs to matter. Audrey Hepburn believed that compassion was not about scale, it was about choice. Her life proved that even a single encounter, a A single witness to a single death can change the way the world listens. Audrey Hepburn once lit up movie screens. Later, she brought light to places where hope had nearly vanished. By refusing to look away, she challenged the rest of us to do the same. Audrey Hepburn's legacy is written in the lives she refused to ignore. By turning fame into responsibility, she showed us that compassion is not a passive emotion, it is an action. And sometimes, that action begins simply by staying, when it would be easier to leave.